Hello everybody, I'm Kate Cass, and welcome to our edition of Let's Talk About, and welcome to the latest installment of MCU TV. Now we enter the realm of the character who was probably the most obvious choice to get a high-budget miniseries at, unfortunately, the most inconvenient time, Loki. When Loki escaped from custody during the Avengers' time-traveling interference, he found himself right back in trouble with another authority group, the Time Variance Authority. Now in the heart of perhaps the most powerful organization in the universe, Loki joins their ranks in the hope of taking it all for himself while confronting the real question of what his place in the universe really is. If Marvel was going to branch out and give some of their side characters dedicated miniseries, Loki was going to be high up on that list of candidates since he is one of the most popular characters in the entire franchise. Heck, if this was 10 years ago, I'd say he was the most popular. But there was one itty bitty little problem with that.
No resurrections this time.
It's Vision all over again. So the challenge the crew of the show now had to tackle was, how do they bring Loki back without undoing his death in Infinity War? Well, there was only one way to do that, with the MCU's most faulty plot device,
time travel!
I talked about this before, but the way the MCU has utilized time travel has been confusing, to say the least. Look, I know there are no real scientific principles to apply to time travel, but that's why it's essential that when you use time travel in fiction, you set the rules up right away. Especially when you tell the audience that the way they usually think of time travel doesn't apply here. Except when it does. One of the biggest crimes to this lack of clarity was committed with the segue Avengers Endgame has into the Loki series. Why none of the Avengers bothered to look for Loki after he took off is still one of the biggest questions the movie leaves unanswered. I know they had bigger problems, but you guys remember why you assembled in the first place, right? Because Loki plus Infinity Stone equals bad. Now, in fairness to the Loki series, they do try to expand and hone in on those very fuzzy plot threads left behind in the second act of Endgame, by having an organization who claims to be the ultimate authority on time travel, the Time Variance Authority, or TVA for short. Their task? Monitor events in the universe from the beginning to the end of time on the sacred timeline, and if something threatens to branch off from that sequence of events, to contain and neutralize it. So after that little stunt Loki pulls, they pick him up and arrest him before he can do any more damage to the timeline. Well, it's nice to know someone got on that, and when they bring him back to their headquarters, it's remarkable how it stands out and how unremarkable it is. The old school 1970s style designs for the architecture and technology of the TVA offices is unexpected, but makes it feel unique from other organizations like it in fiction. They're super advanced, but don't really show off about it. They're above that. Their goal is efficiency, not flashiness, one of the many ways they contrast with Loki. The setting also provides a handy expositional video narrated by Tara Strong. I want all exposition to be delivered by a rubber-hosed cartoon character in an old-school PSA from now on. It would make everything easier. Now, when the function of the TVA was explained, my first thought was, why did Loki get in trouble for messing with time, but the Avengers didn't? Well, according to the TVA, it's because they were supposed to mess with time. It all played out as it was meant to on the sacred timeline. Wow, if that is not plot armor at its finest. Well, my aggravation at time travel in this universe aside, my actual biggest concern with the show going in was what they were going to do about Loki. The thing is, I loved what they did with Loki after the Avengers, particularly what happened in Ragnarok. He gets everything he ever wanted, loses everything alongside Thor, and realizes where he really wanted to be is at his brother's side, at least for now. Now don't get me wrong, I get why they made this show. A series about Loki practically writes itself when it comes to the absurd and entertaining possibilities. The DB Cooper scene was pretty solid proof of that, but having this show star a version of Loki straight off of the failure of the Battle of New York made me feel like we were regressing the character to somewhere more familiar and easier to write, and I'm usually not fond of that. Even when it seems like a character has completed their arc, a good writer can usually find other places to go with them. But this is when Loki was at his most popular, so might as well work from there, I guess. I'm not quite sure how you could have made this show in a way that wouldn't undermine his death in Infinity War a little bit, but I think deep down we all knew that wasn't gonna stick. And they do have a pretty lemonade response to the lemon they were thrown with the mere pitch of this series. Putting Loki into a scenario where he doesn't understand anything that's happening or how to gain the upper hand is a solid setup. Loki's personality and approach to getting himself out of trouble contrasts heavily with the methods of the TVA. Dropping the god of mischief in front of an organization built around upholding the highest level of structure and order imaginable is naturally going to cause some conflict. Where this excels, though, is when it gets existential. See, the TVA's whole thing is about maintaining a certain timeline of events, with nothing diverging from what is meant to occur. As a result, Loki is forced to confront the role he plays in the universe, the hard truth that he's only ever meant to be an obstacle for stronger people to overcome. The one who loses the fight so the victors can be ready for more important threats. The only thing he contributes to the universe is pain and suffering. This is punctuated by Loki seeing his future, that if he continues on this path of selfish aggrandizing, he'll be indirectly responsible for his mother's death. Not just that, but he sees the life he could have led, the loss and gain and unexpected twists, ultimately ending in a death that sticks against a villain who caused greater damage than he ever did. I wasn't a fan of plucking Loki from the timeline before he'd had so much character development, but this scene where Loki looks into the future, seeing all the moments of the rest of his life, good and bad, that he'll likely never get to live now, is a truly astounding moment that takes full advantage of the situation they've been written into. Tom Hiddleston's performance is astounding too. Scenes like this are where I think these Disney Plus shows really shine. Those quiet moments of reflection, of processing the events in front of you with overwhelming emotion that you can't articulate but still can't hold in. There are quite a few moments like that in this show, and they're all great, but this is easily the best one. Loki's attitude doesn't necessarily change after this, but his approach does somewhat. He can't play this game like he usually does. Loki may have a strong control over magic and a silver tongue polished with centuries of trickery, but the fact of the matter is none of that's gonna work here. That doesn't stop him from trying though. Loki being surrounded by people who have no time or patience for his grandstanding attitude is part of what gives this series its charm. Turns out watching Loki get smacked around is still delightful to watch after all these years. Luckily, there's a TVA agent who wants to recruit Loki for a special mission, Mobius, played by Owen Wilson, which might be an odd casting choice, but I think Owen Wilson is one of those actors that we all picked on for a while, even though he's a perfectly fine actor. Not Oscar-worthy, but the kind who can really disappear into a role, which you wouldn't guess, but more often than not with him, I see the character, not the actor. Mobius is one of the more empathetic TVA agents. He follows protocol, but isn't afraid to try an unconventional direction. Not an uncommon archetype, and one that in the wrong hands Loki would easily upstage, but this is a more equal partnership than it first appears, because Mobius is just as quick and clever as Loki. Their first meeting has Mobius calling out the hypocrisy in Loki's disapproval of what the TVA does, bringing up that deep down, he wants the same thing the TVA does. Ultimate power over the choices of inferior beings. Basically, in order to get him on their side, Mobius has the daunting task of psychoanalyzing the god of mischief. Godspeed, my good sir. That's more or less the relationship for the rest of the series, and honestly, it kind of rules. It's not often Loki is teamed up with someone who can see through all his boasting and work on his level. They have a pretty fun antagonistic dynamic, with each trying to outsmart the other, with conflicting ideologies that eventually evolves into a sort of mutual respect over their convictions, working together as long as they have to, just to get what the other wants. But if the TVA can neutralize anything Loki throws at them without breaking a sweat, why do they need his help? Well, Mobius thinks he can be helpful in tracking down a renegade variant, someone like Loki, who is displaced on the timeline, who has been eluding them for ages now. Mobius even gets a clue to their identity in his first scene in the show. Oh no. No, I can't. I can't go down the Mephisto theory hole again. Please, not again! Okay, no, it's not Mephisto. It's a variant of Loki, which is why Mobius wants to consult Loki on it. Simple enough. Except that race only lasts one episode. Where it gets complicated is when they track this variant down, and it was certainly a surprising reveal. This Loki is a lady. Not unprecedented if you're familiar with the comics, I know, but still, a surprise nonetheless. This Loki variant, who goes by the name Sylvie to avoid confusion, played by Sophia DiMartino, confronts Loki, and like everyone else in the show, is not at all concerned with him or his scheming. The buildup is what really works about Sylvie's reveal to me, possessing and brainwashing people with a simple wave of her hand. It keeps you in suspense on when you're finally going to see her true form, while also demonstrating how powerful she is. Though, if there's one thing that it seems like all Lokis have in common, it's never being able to resist a touch of the dramatic.
God, now I understand why Thor found this so annoying.
The series does take a slight turn after Sylvie's introduction, where before it seemed like Loki was taking a hard look at himself and trying something different. The first chance he gets, he falls back into his old ways and abandons the TVA to pursue his variant, who are a little occupied dealing with the after effect of Sylvie bombing the sacred timeline, causing several unstable branches. Wow, way to literally drop a bombshell at the end of the episode. Look at all these locations these branches are coming from. Can you imagine how difficult it'll be for the TVA to contain all of that? Yeah, even with the perspective he's gained, Loki hasn't really changed yet. He still wants ultimate power overall, and he thinks Sylvie is the key to overthrowing the Timekeepers to get it, because that's her goal as well. But this creates a situation where Loki is trapped once again in a position where most of his usual tricks aren't going to work, because he's trying to outsmart himself. Having possibly two of the most untrusting and untrustworthy people in the multiverse stranded and forced to work together to survive because they need each other to succeed is a really solid premise for a series, I'll give them that. But after one episode of wandering a doomed planet, they're picked up again by the TVA, who dealt with that whole bombing the timeline problem off screen. So that's great. That's cool. I'm glad such a universe-shattering distraction could be solved in the span of a single episode with what seemed like little effort, and another Doomsday-level scenario can be cleaned up and reset to help the plot move on. I sure hope they keep doing this again, and again, and again. Yeah, okay, this is probably my biggest critique of the show. There's a firm direction on where the series is going and the ultimate goal waiting at the end, but in between, there's a lot going on, with each episode focusing on a largely different premise, almost always in different locations, that have little connection beyond the overarching mystery behind the true purpose of the TVA. The two Marvel shows before this, and the same goes for Hawkeye, felt like one continuing story, even with episodic events. The actions in one episode directly affected the next as circumstances stacked on top of each other. Now, I know that's a common complaint with these year one shows, that they feel more like extended movies than a serialized miniseries. And that's a valid critique because they're right. But the pace, even when it slowed down, still made it feel like everything left an impact, you know? Here, though, it felt to me like those big cliffhangers were a backdrop to distract any characters they needed to get out of the way for a while to keep the focus on Loki. I'm just now realizing that I think I'm saying that Loki hijacked his own show, but yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. There are a lot of cool, shocking moments in the show, but they're erased almost immediately in the next episode. Just imagine for a second if, after Agnes was revealed to be Agatha Harkness, Wanda just ran out of there and went back to trying to maintain the town. Or if John Walker murdering the Flag Smasher was followed by Sam watching his trial in DC on the news. That's what a lot of the follow-ups on these twists and cliffhangers felt like to me. A lot of impactful moments that don't leave a lasting impact. I could see some people making the argument that this makes Loki feel more like a proper series than the others, having episodic events with a continuing storyline in the back. But for me personally, how often things got hand-waved or resolved was really frustrating, especially considering they kept doing it. Now, to anyone who might be annoyed at me complaining about their favorite MCU show, watch as I argue against my own complaint. I think this is a problem with the show, and one that annoys me watching it in its entirety, but what works about this approach is that it allows room to expand on where they can take the series in the short time they have. Each episode had a new obstacle, new characters, a new tone. You can go from a superhero procedural to a character-focused runaway with very different versions of the same character, to an intense existential confrontation, to an escapade with even more versions of the exact same character. As much as I think the segues between these episodes lack substantial closure, it keeps things interesting and unpredictable for sure. The premise is also a fun excuse to visit different places in time and even space, all without a police box.
You're trying to be funny.
Traveling to the Renaissance, fairs held in the 1970s, a planet on the brink of destruction, a superstore in the middle of a hurricane. I know there have been action scenes in superstores before, but it's always so much fun. And of course,
Pompeii.
should have guessed this premise would wind up with Loki making a scene in Pompeii. Seems like a natural conclusion in hindsight. But the most important and prominent thing focused on throughout these episodes is the character conflict, specifically around Loki. All these different obstacles with different characters, almost all of which leave him at a disadvantage, something he's really not used to, offers opportunities to both have fun with the character and challenge him in compelling ways. Stuff like Loki having to work within strict protocols and do tedious research adds to the humility he's been forced into.
Don't tell me the variant ambushed and killed another team of Minutemen. And stole their reset charge as well.
and having both Lokis compare their life stories and magic skills. This is one of the best scenes in the entire series, by the way. It's charming, well written, and the actors work really well off each other. It's those small character moments that I really love in this franchise, given the luxury of extra time these shows have to offer. Indulging more in casual discussions between the characters, and in the process, giving us some of the show's most beloved and memorable moments. Like this.
Must have been would-be princesses? Or perhaps another prince?
A bit of both.
I know on some level we shouldn't be celebrating a queer villain, but Loki is kind of a special case. He means a lot to a lot of people, and so did that simple line. They're happy, so I'm happy for them. My favorite moment, though, is when Loki gets absolutely wasted and sings Asgardian folk songs on the Doomsday Train.
Another!
Again, these are the moments that are worth the price of admission. But as disjointed as I think it is in execution, the show definitely has a story to tell, and on a personal character level, a pretty strong one. And that becomes abundantly clear when we find out what Sylvie is really trying to accomplish and why. Unlike her Y chromosome counterpart, she has a personal stake in this mission to overthrow the Timekeepers. She's not after some vague idea of power and conquest. Sylvie's motives are deeply rooted in revenge. The TVA deemed her a variant as a child. We never even find out what she did to designate herself as a variant, because even her arresting officer doesn't remember what it was. Because it didn't matter. The why wasn't as important to them as the what. While Loki's time with the TVA was spent taking a hard look at his own actions and how that should shape his future, Sylvie's time, however brief, was spent realizing her own worth, paradoxically by someone telling her that she was worthless. She knew that wasn't true. It couldn't be. So something must be wrong with the organization persecuting her. The right to exist is one of the few that should be granted to every living thing, regardless of who they are. So if someone burst into your room and said that your very existence is wrong and must be eradicated, by that logic, I can't blame Sylvie for being bitter and seeing something fundamentally wrong with that system. That's what has to be brought down. But instead of doing that through bureaucracy, Sylvie's plan is to just kill the people at the top and dismantle everything in the process. You know, like how some people want a Steven Universe to end. But those are seeds of doubt that she begins to plant in the more persuadable agents in the TVA. See, as a side effect of Sylvie's enchantment, some of the other TVA agents are able to see memories and fragments from before they were in the TVA. As it turns out, they're variants as well. All of them. Which not only contradicts what they were told by the Timekeepers, but it means they were pulled away from homes and jobs and families they loved to serve someone else's purposes. The thing a lot of these agents have in common, even Mobius, is that they all trust the Timekeepers, because they were told they had a greater destiny, that they were crusaders for a greater good. Do your part, and the universe will be a better, more harmonious place. But what happens when, even if the mission is the same, there's deception and a lot of it propping it up? How strong can that foundation be after that? What's more significant, discovering the truth or believing you're doing the right thing?
No one wants to think they've wasted their life following the wrong person.
When Loki brings these claims to Mobius, he waves them off, but as we discussed, Mobius isn't naive. He's eager to find answers and do his job to the best of his ability. Unfortunately for the organization, he's a little too good at investigating, as he too starts to see past the facade. It's a really effective twist that none of them want to believe at first because it's too painful. But that difficult process of discovery and confronting that reality is really well executed across the board. Once the agents who realize this accept it, they can't go back to the way they were before. It creates a domino effect that, through less than ideal circumstances, gets the Lokis what they wanted: a face-to-face encounter with the Timekeepers.
Gracious Timekeepers.
Oh, I thought you'd be taller.
So those are the Timekeepers, huh? I mean, I guess you can't use giant monumental statues for scale, but even if they're kind of small, they're still pretty cool. I'm excited to finally confront these beings and their philosophies face to... okay, never mind. Look, I know almost anything in this franchise is a guaranteed success for Disney to cash in on, but this is a little too early to be planning the theme park animatronics, don't you think? Yes, it turns out Sylvie was right. There is a bigger conspiracy behind who's really running the TVA. But it'll be another episode and a half at least before we figure that out, so it's probably important to bring this discussion back to Loki before we go any further. This show started with Loki being forced to look at the role he's played in the universe and decide what he's going to do about it. Until now, the plan was to keep scheming as usual and hopefully acquire the greatest power in the universe. The problem is that, as we've discussed, Loki has been dropped into a situation where he can't stick to his old tricks, which not only forces him to examine those choices and methods more thoroughly, but actually push himself to do things differently. This is clear in pretty much any interaction he has with Sylvie, but I think an example that shows us the best is in episode 5, where Loki is dropped onto a barren landscape at the end of time with more variants of himself. While this is mostly an excuse to indulge in how similar but different and outright absurd these variations are, Alligator Loki took the internet by storm and Richard E. Grant is always a win in my eyes, it also further examines pushing Loki to his limits in order to change the role he plays in life. Loki's desire all this time has been to rule, to conquer. It's what drives him in all of his actions, including on the show. These Lokis, however, don't have that pursuit anymore. They're in a position where there are no more plans to concoct or schemes to pull. Aside from the variants constantly fighting and betraying each other to come out on top, which, while funny, speaks to a tragedy in the God of Mischief. All that's left to do for these Lokis is survive, which they can do, they're good at that, but even if they're alive, what is there to live for? There's a scene earlier in the show where, as punishment from the TVA, Loki is placed in a sort of prison of repetitive punishment.
You.
Sif!
Oh hey Sif, nice to see you again. Glad you could find some time in your schedule to make it appear. Oh! Nope, still funny. This is where Loki is at his most vulnerable. He admits that he's afraid of being alone. However, it's his chaotic acting out that causes him to be alone. His very nature and his refusal before now to defy it is what pushes people away. Who wants a companion they can't trust? Who likes betrayal because it's fun? Once again, I mourn for the fact that we live in a world now where Loki will never know that feeling of camaraderie, because in another time, he would come to find it. In fact, just imagine what it would be like for him to sit down with these other versions of himself, including Sylvie, all of them lost and alone, as the version who was able to get everything he ever wanted, ruling Asgard for a while, mending his relationship with his family. I will say, as frustrated as I am by that, the show does have a solid compromise on not being able to go in that direction, because inadvertently, in all these pursuits to fight for himself and accomplish his own goals, Loki found something he never has before: people to fight for. Think about it. He doesn't gain anything by trying to tell Mobius the truth about the TVA, but he wants to help someone he now considers a friend discover who he really is and that he's being deceived. Maybe because deep down, he knows what it's like to be told you're something you're really not all your life, but that might be me digging too deep into this. And taking that chance and trying to help Mobius works out in his favor. Just as Loki is beaten down in that never-ending loop, ready to give up on himself, believe everything everyone said he was, Mobius steps in, and through the way Loki opened his eyes to how the TVA deceived him, he goes against everything he's been told to believe in and tells Loki he can be whatever he wants to be with the utmost confidence. All things considered, it's a really triumphant and affirming moment, maybe the biggest one in the entire series. Then there's his relationship with Sylvie. Okay, I've danced around this long enough. You want to know or be reminded of how the TVA found them together? Because they created a Nexus event they could track. How? By almost kissing. Yeah, Loki and Sylvie start falling in love with each other. A love that the very universe says is out of place. Yeah, I know Loki's biggest character trait is his narcissism, but this is taking it a step too far, isn't it? This was perhaps the most divisive development in the show. Actually, scratch that. It was the most divisive. And I get it, because it grosses me out too. I know there's no real world equivalent here, so I don't think the word incest applies like a lot of fans were throwing around at the time, but man, does it still weird me out. And they dwell on this a lot. It tints pretty much all of Loki and Sylvie's interactions from that point on, and it made me so uncomfortable. Mobius kind of sums it up perfectly.
That could break reality. It's breaking my reality right now. What a incredible seismic narcissist.
But thankfully, this does not completely swallow up Loki's character arc. Once he starts to develop his, feelings for Sylvie, his motives start to change. He still has the same goal, but it has a real purpose to it now, because it has a purpose to her. And by the time we get to the confrontation with the monster that stands between them and who's responsible for all this, Loki pushes himself farther than he ever has before. Earlier in the show, Sylvie explains how she enchants people, gets into their minds, and manipulates them. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first watched this bit, I thought this was foreshadowing a mental battle with the head of the TVA, or even Loki. That at some point she was going to have an epic mental battle with a strong-minded adversary. Using that power on Eliath isn't the way I expected that to be paid off, but it is pretty cool, and a significant moment for Loki, attempting something new and pushing his magic farther than he ever imagined. It's a pretty cool moment on paper, but personally, I wish in execution that it was a bigger deal. Maybe having those flashes that Sylvie does and Loki being overwhelmed by them, but being able to power through because he's not fighting alone for once. But it does show that, like he said, he's no longer the kind of person who would betray his loved ones for his own gain. And you know what? I believe him. I just wish Sylvie wasn't that kind of loved one to him.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Stop, this is weird. Alright, we made it to the edge of the universe or whatever. Now we have reached the final episode, the big climactic moment. Can someone please finally explain what the heck is going on here? Yeah! Okay, maybe I'll take back what I said about getting all the exposition through her. Funnily enough, fans had been suspicious of Miss Minutes for a little bit before this, so as soon as she showed up in the castle, I just kept thinking, are we actually doing this? Are they really going there? As funny as that would have been, thankfully, no. After that little psych out, we get to the real mastermind behind all of this. A being known simply as He Who Remains, played by Jonathan Majors. Hey, wait a second. I know that guy. Okay, first off, Jonathan Majors is having way too much fun as this character. I'd be more amused by watching him perform as the playful and mysterious deity with all the answers but no interest in sharing them, as it's one of my favorite character tropes and he's really rocking it, if there wasn't 30 minutes left in the show and I just wanted to know what's happening. By Odin's beard, he does eventually sit the Lokis down and we're finally properly told how He Who Remains orchestrated all this and why. And it's weird. Really weird. To the point that, honestly, I can't quite claim that I get it. Okay, that's not fair. I kind of get it. But it took at least 3 watch-throughs of this episode and 2 friends explaining it to me to get there. Even without the announcement ahead of time that Jonathan Majors had been cast as Kang the Conqueror in the MCU, it's pretty clear that that's what they're going for here. They certainly drop enough hints.
I've been dubbed many names by many people. A conqueror.
Except this version of Kang wasn't a conqueror. I think. Where this gets complicated is the idea that he ran into other versions of himself across other universes, spreading knowledge and collaborating on the betterment of their worlds, until they cross paths with the inevitable evil version that we all have somewhere out there apparently, and war was waged. A multiversal war to determine universal supremacy. Eventually this leads to this being formerly known as Kang, I assume the one from the main MCU timeline, though that's never made quite clear, using his great powers to forge one sacred timeline, which he's been monitoring and presumably controlling all this time, with the TVA as agents to do his legwork, so to speak. Now, I will say that I like the subversion of the tropes that come with meeting alternate versions of yourself. The idea of running into an evil version of yourself if you come across enough multiversal doppelgangers is hardly anything new. It's almost as old as sci-fi. But this has something of a twist to it, with one version seeking to end any possible future evil from any other version of themselves, to the point that he's basically controlling that entire universe so well that no one notices, but is pulling the strings so well that he's writing the book on this universe, including Loki and Sylvie's supposed rebellion.
You can't kill me because I already know what's going to happen.
How'd you know that, Mr. Remains? Did you read the script? What's on your desk there? Is that the script? See, this is why Marvel is so strict about leaks. What I didn't get is if what He Who Remains did hid the timeline we've been following all this time from the others, or destroyed the other universes who wish to interfere with it. From what we've seen in Phase 4 since, I'm inclined to go with the former. But if that's the case, then why go to all this trouble? Like, those other universes aren't gone, they just don't seem to be aware of each other. Is this whole plot to prevent other universes from being created based on everyday actions? Or is it to prevent people from advancing enough to figure out how to interact with those universes? Because if a teenager can accidentally do it twice, it doesn't seem that hard. I get what they were going for, or at least I think I do, but it's perhaps a bit too convoluted for its own good. I don't think you needed this much elaboration to explain why there hasn't been any interaction with the multiverse before now. There are some cool ideas, yeah, but I haven't seen overcompensation this unnecessary since the live-action Beauty and the Beast. And Jonathan Majors can monologue in front of that hidden Mickey as much as he wants. It's not gonna change my mind. You could also make the argument that it's a reveal that destroys any agency or powerful choices made in the cinematic universe up to this point because it was all planned out by a higher power, but I don't think that was an implication they intended to make, so I'm not gonna read into that. I don't have it in me. From here on, the finale dissolves into a mental chess game, with the Lokis trying to decide if they should continue with their plan or heed He Who Remains' warnings. It's hard to tell if the Lokis are seeing through the deception of a chess master, or if they're refusing to accept that they may still be the bad guys here. Sylvie and Loki reach a stalemate. The manipulator and the distrustful confront what to do about this man and if he's telling the truth. It is a tough question, I'll give them that. Everyone here is so good at manipulating that it's not an obvious answer for the audience either, which is a little frustrating on your first watch, I will admit, or at least it was for me, but in retrospect, a mental, moral battle is a unique climax. A lot of people are fond of this finale, and it's easy to see why, because it breaks away from the typical superhero solution of solving problems by punching and blasting things. It's different, and as I've said in previous videos, anything that is distinct from the dozens of other stories in this franchise immediately stands out and should be appreciated. But this is where the Loki's paths differ. For once, Loki sees the bigger picture, beyond his own needs or desires. This is far greater than him. Even if he's not sure if He Who Remains is telling the truth about the repercussions, he doesn't want to risk it. He's basically admitting to not having the upper hand here, and that is substantial growth for Loki. So Loki tries to reason with Sylvie. They already decided together that they weren't going to be persuaded or convinced to slot back into their natural roles. Even when given the chance to have everything they could possibly want, they turn it down to see this through to the end. Even if it's one with a happy ending, they don't want to follow a predetermined path anymore.
We write our own destiny now.
Despite how it may seem, since he's considering doing what He Who Remains tells them, which on paper is exactly what they've been fighting against this whole time, Loki is still following that philosophy of veering from that laid out path. Because for once, he's putting the needs of the many ahead of his own, even if it's just theoretically, and even if it's just for one other person. But Sylvie can't be reasoned with, because trust is needed to do that. I do believe Loki has changed, that he's acknowledged his own actions and the cause of them, and is willing to truly forge a new path. Unfortunately, Sylvie hasn't. No matter how hard he tries, no matter how sincerely he speaks to her, her convictions are unmoving, and she falls back into the mindset of only relying on herself. Nothing's enough. Not even this. Thanks, I hate it. Well, it doesn't matter anyway. Sylvie does a classic Loki backstab, whooshes him back to the TVA, and goes through with her ultimate goal. The gates to the multiverse have been opened. And I will say, for all my complaining about the execution of this twist and incorporating the multiverse, the actual scene watching it be forged is pretty spectacular. It's one of those whimper not a bang kind of moments. It's really effective. What's less effective is how the show ends. Loki is back in the TVA, which is still there even though He Who Remains is gone, but Loki can't explain what happened because no one knows who he is, and the statues of the Timekeepers are replaced with He Who Remains. Or Kang, maybe? Did the timeline change around Loki? Did Sylvie accidentally send him to another universe? How did he wind up like this? What the heck is happening? Okay, never mind, guess we're done. Well, overall, I am so tired. I don't know if this is obvious from what I've said in the video so far, because this has been far and away the most difficult script I've ever had to put together, but Loki is probably, and I'm sorry to say this, my least favorite MCU Disney Plus show. Now, does that mean I think Loki is bad? No, not at all. But for whatever reason, It didn't grab me. For most of its run, I felt perplexed by the direction it wanted to take, and when we got to the destination, still not really understanding it. While it did a lot of interesting stuff with challenging a post-Avengers version of Loki, I can't say it was worth the loss of all of his past development yet. Not to mention that really icky romance that still squicks me out. Man, WandaVision really spoiled us. It did all this so much better. This is definitely the most episodic MCU show from year one, and my frustrations with how it moves through those events to get to the end might be on me, because it's not what I was used to. I was having a tough time accepting that this show was trying to be a show. But you come here for my feelings and opinions, and I want the superhero procedural with Loki and Mobius to last more than one episode, okay? And that's to say nothing of the climax. I don't mind complexity, but when you've spent 6 episodes building up to this reveal, and the backstory is so far removed from our protagonist, and it's setting up the next big arc in your franchise that, in my opinion, the other examples that have used the multiverse in the MCU so far have done a much better job setting up what it is and how it works, that's a problem for me. And that last minute, like, what was that? Now, all that said, I could definitely see why it would be a favorite for a lot of people. It takes on really existential questions about purpose, identity, and your perception of yourself versus the perception of others. People's actions are driven by the fact that they want to believe that they are doing the right thing, which is something of a running theme through Wave 1 of Marvel Disney Plus shows. Loki is perhaps the best demonstration of challenging those preconceived notions, and what is lost and gained by doing so. Are those losses worth what you gain? And every character answers that differently. There's a lot of brilliantly written debates and introspective moments covering this stuff, and the performances are remarkable from everyone involved, seasoned with the typical wit and antics that give the MCU its charm. This show is also drop dead gorgeous. There are a lot of varying locations that are all memorable and beautifully realized, with some excellent cinematography exemplifying it. There's a lot to like about Loki. I do think Loki had a lot of cool ideas and moments of unique story beats and character development. However, I don't think all those elements worked well together. Watching episodes individually, I think the show is great, even parts of the last one. But altogether, the best way I can describe how Loki feels to me is unfocused. By the end, the show almost felt unfinished. There were tons of unresolved plot points left in the air. What this all means for the TVA, what happened to Sylvie, what Loki is supposed to do now, and whatever the deal was with Renslayer, who I didn't even mention in this video. All of this left me feeling even more unsatisfied with the finale. However, that might be because Loki is in a different position than the other year 1 shows. It wasn't announced until the season ended, but Loki was meant to have at least 2 seasons, meaning not all the plot threads could or would be wrapped up because we have a whole other season to do that in, which was definitely unexpected to me. I thought all these miniseries were one and done. Well, leave it to Loki to break the mold. As much as having to review this show comprehensively almost broke my brain, and I'm dreading having to do it again, I'm still more than open to more of the show. There's a reason Loki is so popular. He's a multi-dimensional character that can make almost any situation entertaining as long as you drop him in the middle of it. So if you want to see more of Loki just doing his thing, maybe with a sentimental moment sprinkled in every once in a while, you'll get plenty of that, and it is quite a treat. You might have seen this old article floating around when the show was airing from when Tom Hiddleston was first cast in the part back in 2011, criticizing the choice of casting a nobody. That nobody who, 10 years later, was the face of the biggest show that summer. The fact that we went from Loki possibly not even being in Thor: The Dark World to the lead of his own show for at least 2 seasons is quite an achievement and should be recognized as such. Can this show win me over a bit more with another season? Possibly. Only time will tell. Thanks for watching, everyone. Definitely let me know what you thought of the show in the comments below. Maybe you comprehended it better than me. That's why the series is called Let's Talk About. I want to give a very special thanks to my patrons who help support my content, including Chelsea A. Crandall, David L. Sproul, Hawk Hero, Jinx Productions, and Wait in the Wings. If you'd like to join these fine people in supporting my content while getting cool exclusive perks, you can check out my Patreon page at the link in the description, as well as my other social media if you'd like to check out any of those. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.
He's Squidward, he's Squidward, you're Squidward, I'm Squidward! Are there any other Squidwards I should know about?
Meow.